This 1910 portrait of two farmhands looks normal until you notice the wrist wrap. It seemed like a straightforward donation. Two boys leaning against a barn, faces blank with exhaustion, tools in hand. The kind of image that turns up in estate sales all over the Midwest, filed under rural life and forgotten, until one detail refused to stay buried. Marcus Ellison had been the senior archivist at a regional history museum in Topeka for 11 years when the photograph arrived in a cardboard box full of glass plate negatives. The collection had belonged to a commercial photographer named H.W. Sutter, who had operated a studio in Leavenworth County between 1898 and 1923. Most of what Sutter left behind was predictable. Wedding portraits, Main Street storefronts, church groups standing stiff in their Sunday clothes. But this image was different. It had been stored separately from the others, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string that had gone brittle with age. The photograph showed two teenage boys, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, seated on overturned crates against the weathered planks of a barn wall. Their clothes were rough work shirts and trousers held up by suspenders. Each held a farm implement. One gripped a hoe. The other rested a pitchfork across his knees. Their expressions were flat, not quite sullen, but emptied of something. The kind of faces Marcus had seen before in photographs of men after long labor, but rarely in boys this young. He scanned the image at high resolution and began examining the details the way he always did, section by section, looking for context. The barn boards, the shadow angle, suggesting late afternoon, the style of the tools, consistent with the period. And then his eye caught something on the boy holding the pitchfork. His left wrist was wrapped in a strip of cloth. At first, Marcus assumed it was a bandage, perhaps covering a blister or minor cut. But as he zoomed in, the texture of the fabric became clearer. It was not gauze or cotton. It was a heavier weave, with faint vertical stripes barely visible through the grime. And along the torn edge, there was a fragment of printed lettering. Two partial words, smudged but legible under magnification: state and form. Marcus leaned back from his monitor. He had spent years handling photographs from this era. He knew what state-issued uniforms looked like. He knew which institutions used that particular striped fabric, and he knew that boys wearing it were not supposed to be on private farms, holding tools, being photographed like hired hands. This was not a portrait of farmhands. This was something else entirely, something that someone, perhaps Sutter himself, had hidden away for over a century. Marcus had come to archival work through a winding path. He had trained as a social historian, specializing in progressive-era institutions, the orphanages and reformatories and industrial schools that had spread across the country in the late 19th century. His doctoral thesis had focused on the rhetoric of rehabilitation in juvenile justice, the way reformers promised to save wayward children while building systems that often resembled prisons. He had read thousands of pages of annual reports, admission logs, and inspection records. He had seen how the language of care could mask something much darker. That background made this photograph feel like a summons. He removed the glass plate from its sleeve with gloved hands and held it up to the light. The negative was in good condition, no cracks or emulsion damage. On the edge of the plate, scratched into the coating with a stylus, was a number 1142, and below it, a date, September 1910. He turned the plate over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a single word: contracted. Marcus set the plate down carefully and opened his laptop. He typed the name H.W. Sutter into a genealogical database and began tracing the photographer's history. Sutter had operated his studio in Leavenworth County for 25 years. He had photographed local politicians, business owners, and farming families. He had also, according to a brief mention in a 1907 newspaper, been commissioned to take portraits at the Kansas State Industrial School for Boys, a reformatory located just outside the city. The industrial school had been established in 1881 to house boys convicted of minor crimes or deemed incorrigible by local courts. By 1910, it held over 300 inmates between the ages of 10 and 18. The institution's stated mission was to train boys in useful trades and moral discipline. But Marcus knew from his research that places like this often relied on another source of income entirely: labor contracts. He pulled up the annual reports of the Kansas State Industrial School from the early 1900s. The language was dry and bureaucratic, full of references to industrial training and character development, but buried in the financial sections, he found what he was looking for. Under the heading Outside Placements, the superintendent reported that a number of boys had been assigned to local farms and businesses during the summer months as part of their rehabilitation. The farmers paid a small fee to the institution. The boys received no wages. The arrangement was presented as educational, a chance for troubled youth to learn the value of honest work. Marcus stared at the photograph again. 2 boys, tools in hand, one with a torn strip of reformatory uniform wrapped around his wrist, perhaps to hide the fabric from the camera, perhaps to hide something else underneath. He needed to know who these boys were, and he needed to know what had happened to them. The first expert Marcus contacted was Dr. Eleanor Vance, a historian at the University of Kansas who had written extensively on juvenile incarceration in the Great Plains states. She agreed to meet him at the museum the following week, and when she arrived, she spent nearly an hour studying the photograph in silence. "The wrist wrap is the key," she said finally. "Boys at these institutions wore uniforms made from a standardized fabric, gray with blue stripes, produced by prison labor in Missouri. If this is a fragment of that material, then this boy was either a current inmate or a recent escape." She pointed to the positioning of the cloth. It was wound tightly, overlapping several times, and secured with what looked like a knot tucked under the palm. "This is not a casual bandage. This is someone trying to conceal something, either the uniform itself or an injury beneath it." Marcus asked about the labor contracts. Dr. Vance nodded slowly. The practice was common across the Midwest. Reformatories were expensive to operate, and most states were unwilling to fund them adequately. So superintendents found other ways to balance the books. They leased boys to farmers during planting and harvest seasons. The boys worked 10, 12, sometimes 14-hour days. They slept in barns or outbuildings. They were supervised by the farmers, not by institutional staff. And when they were injured, which happened constantly, they were often punished for slowing down rather than treated. She paused. There are documented cases of boys being beaten for trying to run. Some were chained at night. Some simply disappeared from the records entirely, listed as discharged or transferred, without any follow-up. The institutions had no real way to track what happened once a boy left the grounds, and frankly, many of them did not want to know. Marcus asked about the number scratched into the glass plate. 1142. Dr. Vance suggested it might be an intake number, the identifier assigned to each boy upon admission to the reformatory. If the Kansas State Industrial School had preserved its records, it might be possible to match the number to a name. The records, as it turned out, had survived. They were held in the state archives in Topeka, boxed and cataloged but rarely accessed. Marcus filed a research request and waited. 3 weeks later, he sat in a reading room with a ledger open in front of him. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with columns of handwritten entries: name, age, county of commitment, offense, date of admission, date of discharge. Inmate 1142 was a boy named Samuel Oakes. He had been committed to the industrial school in March of 1909 at the age of 14. His offense was listed as petty theft. His county of origin was Atchison. His date of discharge was blank. Marcus turned to the institution's annual reports for 1910. In the section on outside placements, he found a list of farms that had contracted for labor that summer. One name appeared multiple times: a farmer named Josiah Pruitt, who operated a large wheat concern near Easton. According to the report, Pruitt had received 6 boys over the course of the season. Marcus cross-referenced the dates. Samuel Oakes had been assigned to Pruitt's farm in July 1910. The photograph was dated September 1910, 2 months into the placement. He kept digging. The Pruitt farm appeared in other records as well. A brief item in the Leavenworth Times from October 1910 mentioned that a boy from the industrial school had been injured in a threshing accident on the Pruitt property. The boy's name was not given. He had been returned to the institution for medical treatment. His condition was described as serious but improving. Another item from November of the same year noted that a different boy assigned to Pruitt had attempted to escape. He had been found 2 days later, hiding in a rail yard near Kansas City. He had been returned to the reformatory and placed in solitary confinement for 30 days as punishment. Marcus searched for any mention of Samuel Oakes. There was nothing. No discharge date, no transfer notice, no death record, just the blank space in the ledger where his fate should have been written. The Kansas State Industrial School had closed in 1979. Its grounds had been converted into a minimum security prison, which itself had been decommissioned in the early 2000s. The buildings now stood empty, surrounded by chain-link fencing and overgrown fields. Marcus drove out to see them on a cold morning in February. The main dormitory was a 3-story brick structure with barred windows and a central tower. It looked more like a penitentiary than a school. Behind it, a row of smaller buildings had housed workshops, a laundry, and an infirmary. Most were boarded up, but one had collapsed entirely, leaving a pile of rubble and rusted machinery. He walked the perimeter, taking photographs. Near the back of the property, he found a small cemetery, its headstones weathered and half buried in weeds. Most of the markers bore only numbers, no names, no dates, just digits carved into limestone that had softened with decades of rain. He counted 37 graves. Back in Topeka, he contacted Dr. Vance again. She put him in touch with a colleague named Michael Redmond, who had spent years researching mortality records at juvenile institutions across the region. Redmond was blunt. These places had appalling death rates. Boys died from tuberculosis, typhoid, industrial accidents, beatings that went too far. The institutions rarely reported these deaths accurately. They were afraid of bad publicity, afraid of losing funding, afraid of lawsuits from families who might actually care. So they buried the bodies on site, marked the graves with numbers instead of names, and moved on. Marcus asked about the labor contract specifically. Redmond leaned forward. That was where the worst abuses happened. Once a boy was sent to a farm, he was essentially invisible. The institution claimed jurisdiction, but the farmer had control. If a boy was hurt, the farmer decided whether to report it. If a boy died, the farmer decided whether to return the body or simply bury it on his property. There are cases across the Midwest where boys just vanished. Their families were told they had run away, their files were closed, and no one ever asked what really happened. He paused. The reformatories called it rehabilitation. The farmers called it cheap labor. The boys called it something else. They called it being sold. Marcus returned to the photograph. He stared at the wrist wrap, at the fragment of lettering that spelled out the institution's name. He looked at the boy's face, at the flatness in his eyes, and he began to understand what the image was really showing. This was not a portrait of Farmhands. This was evidence. Someone, perhaps Sutter himself, had documented something that was not supposed to be seen. Two boys, contracted out like equipment, posed against a barn wall with the tools of their bondage in their hands. One of them had wrapped his wrist to hide the fabric that marked him as property of the state. Perhaps he had also wrapped it to hide the marks of restraint, the bruises from ropes or shackles used to keep him from running again. And someone had kept this photograph hidden for over a century, wrapped in brown paper and stored away from the rest of the collection. Perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of a dim awareness that one day someone would look closely enough to see what was really there. Marcus brought his findings to the museum's director, a woman named Patricia Langford, who had held the position for nearly 15 years. He laid out the photograph, the research, the connections to the industrial school and the Prewitt farm. He explained what he believed the image represented, a document of coerced child labor disguised as rehabilitation, hidden in plain sight for over 100 years. Langford listened carefully. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "This is significant," she said finally. "But it is also complicated. The Sutter collection was donated by his descendants. They gave us over 2,000 images, plus the studio's business records and personal correspondence. They expect us to treat their ancestors' legacy with respect." Marcus pointed out that Sutter had hidden this photograph himself. That suggested he knew what it showed. That suggested he was not proud of it. "Perhaps," Langford said, "or perhaps he simply filed it incorrectly. We cannot know his intentions. What we can know is that if we present this image the way you are suggesting, we will be making a very public statement about an era and a practice that many people would prefer to leave in the past." She mentioned the museum's donors, several of whom were descendants of prominent farming families in the region. She mentioned the upcoming capital campaign, which depended on maintaining good relationships with the community. She did not say that Marcus was wrong. She simply said that the timing was difficult. Marcus asked what she proposed instead. Langford suggested that the photograph could be included in a future exhibition on rural labor without the specific emphasis on reform school contracts. The wrist wrap could be noted as an interesting detail without drawing conclusions about its meaning. He left the meeting feeling hollowed out. He had spent months tracing the story behind this image, uncovering a system of exploitation that had touched hundreds of lives. And now he was being asked to soften it, to present it as a curiosity rather than an indictment. But he was not finished. He reached out to Dr. Vance and Michael Redmond. He contacted journalists who covered historical justice issues. He began writing a detailed account of his research, documenting every source, every connection, every piece of evidence that linked the photograph to the broader pattern of reform school labor contracts. 6 months later, the story appeared in a national magazine. It was titled "The Boys Who Were Sold," and it featured the Sutter photograph prominently. The article traced the history of juvenile labor leasing from the Reconstruction era through the Progressive period, showing how institutions that claimed to save children had instead turned them into commodities. It named specific farms, specific superintendents, specific politicians who had looked the other way. And it centered the voices of boys like Samuel Oakes, whose names had been erased from the official record, but whose faces had survived in photographs that no one had bothered to examine closely. The response was immediate. Descendants of boys who had been held at the Kansas State Industrial School began coming forward with their own family stories, passed down through generations. One woman in Missouri had a letter her great-uncle had written in 1912, describing his time on a contract farm in language that made Marcus's stomach turn. Another family had a set of discharge papers that listed their ancestor's condition as good, despite medical records showing he had lost 2 fingers in a machinery accident. The museum, facing public pressure, agreed to mount a full exhibition on the history of reform school labor in the Great Plains. The photograph was displayed at the center of the gallery, accompanied by detailed contextual panels explaining what it showed. Samuel Oakes was identified by name, and his story was told as fully as the fragmentary records allowed. The exhibition included a section on the cemetery behind the old industrial school, with photographs of the numbered headstones and a list of the boys who were believed to be buried there. Patricia Langford spoke at the opening reception. She acknowledged that the museum had initially been hesitant to present the material so directly. She said that Marcus Ellison's persistence had forced the institution to confront its own discomfort and to recognize that telling difficult truths was part of its mission. Marcus stood at the back of the gallery, watching visitors move past the photograph. Some lingered, reading every word of the contextual panels. Others glanced quickly and moved on, perhaps unable to absorb what they were seeing. A few took pictures with their phones, the flash illuminating the 2 boys' faces for a fraction of a second before plunging them back into the ambient light. He thought about Samuel Oakes. He thought about the blank space in the ledger where the boys' discharge date should have been. He thought about the 37 numbered graves in the weeds behind the old reformatory. He thought about all the photographs in all the archives across the country, images that had been filed under rural life or local history, without anyone asking who the people in them really were. Old photographs are not neutral. They were created by people with motives, staged to convey particular messages, preserved or discarded based on what those who came after wanted to remember. The camera captures a moment, but it does not explain it. That work falls to those who look closely enough to see what the image is really showing. In the case of the Sutter photograph, the truth had been hidden in plain sight for over a century. 2 boys holding tools, posed against a barn wall, their faces blank with exhaustion or fear or something deeper. One of them had wrapped his wrist in a strip of fabric that marked him as property of the state, sent to work on a private farm under a system that called itself rehabilitation, but functioned as bondage. The photographer had documented this. Then he had hidden the image away, perhaps sensing that it showed something that should not have been seen, or perhaps hoping that someday someone would find it and understand. Marcus had found it. He had understood. And now, finally, Samuel Oakes had a name and a story that people could not ignore. But there were other photographs, other archives, other boys whose faces had been captured and filed away without explanation. Somewhere in a museum basement or a university collection or a family attic, there were images that held similar secrets: wrist wraps, numbered uniforms, expressions that did not match the caption, details that revealed the violence behind the pose. The work of uncovering them had only begun.